Welcome, good evening. So excited to be here this evening. It's a long time coming and many people have shown support to help this evening come true. My name is Peniel Joseph. I'm the Barbara Jordan Chair in Political Values and Ethics at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And I'm also a professor of history in the College of Liberal Arts. And I'm the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy here at the University of Texas at Austin. And CRD's mission is to promote engaged research and scholarship focused on the ways issues of race, democracy, and public policy impact the lives of global citizens. And on that score, we've convened symposiums, conferences. We have undergraduate and graduate fellows who do engaged research, all related to issues of inequality, of racial justice, of intersectional justice when we think about race, class, gender, sexuality, gender identification, and small d democracy, meaning this idea of democratic institutions and democratic political thought and processes that have nothing to do exclusively with political parties. And so we're very, very pleased tonight to host Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. as part of the William C. Powers Jr. Speaker Series. And I want to read why this series is so important. This series honors the memory of President William C. Powers Jr., former president of University of Texas at Austin, by inviting thought leaders to present research in American politics and public policy and reflection of President Powers' steadfast commitment to diversity and inclusion. This series is sponsored by the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs and the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. I'd also like to thank our entire team at the center that helped to organize this event. Emily Dunkley is our program coordinator who's done indefatigable a job to pull this through. Barbara Kufiadin, Maddie Donham, Janelle Ajani, all of our staff, and really friends at LBJ, including Eileen, who helped organize this. I want to definitely thank them. I also want to thank Jeannie and Mickey Klein for their generous support in making this possible. And lastly, I want to thank really all of our students, our faculty, our staff, and really everyone in the Austin community who came out here to the Blanton, and we have more people coming for this evening with Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. So, without further ado, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., I'll call him Skip because I consider him a dear friend and mentor, is a national treasure. He is the Alphonse Fletcher University Professor and Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. He's an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning filmmaker, literary scholar, journalist, cultural critic, and institution builder. Many of us know him from his PBS series, Finding Your Roots, and Professor Gates was at the cutting edge of understanding that genealogical research could be used to build bridges across racial and ethnic divisions, not just at the national level, but globally as well. He has made 21 films, and we're going to see a clip from his latest, Reconstruction: America After the Civil War. And Professor Gates's work is intimately concerned with the fullness of the Black experience. He has been an institution builder at Harvard University as the founding chair of the Department of African American Studies at Harvard, but he's also been an institution builder in popularizing African American studies and African studies globally. Dr. Gates has made the pursuit of learning about the fullness of Black humanity a lifelong passion. And he does this not just through scholarship, but he also does this through stories. In his best-selling memoir, Colored People, he talks about being raised in Piedmont, West Virginia, and the stories that his father told him while growing up. And he became a master storyteller, not just as a literary scholar and as a public intellectual and as a professor, but also as a filmmaker, as a television host, and as somebody who's really brought the study of the Black experience and the Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latino, Latinx, African experience to global audiences. So when I think about Skip's impact, Skip has really been the most influential intellectual, as far as I'm concerned, of the Black experience and really of race and democracy in the 20th and the 21st century, really ranking alongside of people like W.E.B. Du Bois as an institution builder. So whether you may agree or disagree with what the Black experience actually means, Skip has made an argument that there are a million ways of being Black, and we should really investigate and take those different ways seriously. So in that, he's challenged all kinds of orthodoxies across ideological spectrums. And for that, we should be grateful. The recipient of 55 honorary degrees and numerous prizes, Dr. Gates was a member of the first class of MacArthur Genius Grants, awarded by the MacArthur Foundation in 1981. In 1998, he became the first African-American scholar to be awarded the National Humanities Medal. He was named to Time's 25 Most Influential Americans list in 1997, to Ebony's Power 150 list in 2009. He earned his BA in English and Literature summa cum laude from Yale University, and his MA and PhD in English Literature from Clare College at the University of Cambridge. Professor Gates has directed the WEB, what is now the Hutchins Center, since arriving at Harvard in 1991. And during his last 15 years on campus, his first 15 years on campus, he chaired the Department of African and Afro-American Studies as it expanded into a full-fledged doctoral program. He is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and serves on a wide array of boards, including the New York Public Library, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Aspen Institute, Jazz at Lincoln Center, the Whitney Museum of American Art, Library of America, and the Brookings Institution. I think one of the most coolest aspects of Professor Gates's legacy is that he's got his portrait hung up in the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian. But also for those of us like myself who are really interested in pop culture, Skip makes a fantastic appearance in Watchmen. And Watchmen was such a great series that talked about race, that talked about Tulsa, and he made an appearance as the Secretary of Treasury. So, you know, we had our first African-American Secretary of Treasury right here with Dr. Gates. So we are going to see a clip right now of Reconstruction, America After the Civil War, which is Dr. Gates's latest film. And then we are going to hear from Professor Gates himself. Thank you.
On the evening of June 17, 2015, a stranger walked into an historic Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, known as Mother Emanuel. He prayed with the Wednesday night Bible study group for almost an hour. Then he opened fire.
We have 9 victims, and I do believe this was a hate crime.
Friends say the 21-year-old high school dropout was a loner, an unabashed racist with a deep hatred for Black people.
He just said, I have to do it. He said, you rape our women and you taking over our country.
The massacre in Charleston touched off not only a debate over the Confederate flag, but it touched off a debate all over the country. How did we get here? And why is this happening?
I guess to think of that as a singular horror. And it was convenient, I think, to think of it that way. Unless you really wanted to understand how this could happen, And then that meant that you had to get into the history.
Most of us know that our country fought a civil war in the 1860s, but less is known about what came afterward, the chaotic, exhilarating, and ultimately devastating period known as Reconstruction. If we're looking for the roots of the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, this is where we have to start.
The Reconstruction period is one of extraordinary excitement. The time when America could finally become that land of freedom that it had promised to be since the very beginning.
Black people actually sat in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Poor whites and Black people saw a common cause with one another.
You're seeing this opportunity and imagining that will only get better. And looking back, what we know is those Black folks had no idea of the cliff that they were heading towards.
We do not come here begging for our rights. We come here clothed in the garb of American citizenship. We come demanding our rights in the name of justice.
Richard King could capture an audience. I think all his years in the pulpit made him a really good speaker in the House. He stood up to the white supremacists who were basically calling him, inferior. And he said, look at me, I have 2 eyes, I have 2 ears, I have 2 hands, I have 2 feet. How are we different when it comes to our manhood?
I was amazed when I began to read the speeches of Black congressmen in that period. I mean, here are people who are arguing about what the laws of the nation will provide in terms of human rights and have sophisticated understanding of the underlying principles that make these freedoms necessary in a democratic society. The level of discourse was so far above the level of discourse in Congress today. It was shocking.
In state houses across the South, Black men and white men were attempting to govern together for the first time. In South Carolina, where African Americans made up almost 60% of the population, voters elected a Black majority House of Representatives.
It was the seat of Black power in USA. The Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, State Treasurer.
Unimaginable today.
Absolutely.
Many parts of the South didn't have a educated and experienced Black leadership ready to step into power, which you did have in South Carolina. It had a free Black group before the Civil War in Charleston, which was well educated and politically articulate.
Behind us lie 243 years of suffering, anguish, and degradation. Before us lies our mighty future. That future is ours to shape.
Robert Brown Elliott was very ambitious. He was educated as a lawyer. He had a photographic memory. He was absolutely fearless.
It's hard to imagine more daunting challenges than all these governments have. Some parts of the South had really been devastated by war. So you've got to try to build a forward-looking government at a time where there are very few resources.
The state legislatures create public schools, public hospitals, public welfare systems in a way that hadn't been seen in the South.
Black men go into these legislatures with an idea of how they're going to improve their communities. One of the most important things they do is to establish free public schools.
There were no public education systems in most of the southern states. If you had money to buy it for your children, you had it. If you didn't, well, you did without.
You start to see state constitutions adopting some policy that says education is a right. And this is providing it for all children.
One of the most tragic aspects of Reconstruction is that the more African Americans achieve, the more they put their lives at risk.
I could hear the noise of horses.
They Ku Klux, man.
They had on white gowns, masks on their faces.
75.
They were Ku Klux.
They tore my clothes off.
I was blindfolded. Cut me with knives.
They whipped me.
They whipped me. Put a rope around my neck to hang me.
Southern Democrats used violence and terror tactics to disrupt Republican control and plot their return to power. They saw themselves as the redeemers of their states.
Violence is efficient, it's easy, it's fast, and you can often do it under the cover of night. Klan attacks become so pervasive because that's how widespread the fear of Black enfranchisement is.
The Klan is actually committing atrocities against everyone. They're attacking freedmen and white Southerners who were sympathetic to the Union cause and to the Republican Party.
To their eyes, emancipation was wrong. They are washing the South with blood to redeem it.
This isn't simply a question of trying to return to an earlier way of life. This is actually a political counter-revolution.
12 years after the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction was dealt a devastating blow. You might even say it was overthrown. The Southern Democrats took their states back one by one.
The 1880s is a kind of a twilight zone between Reconstruction and the full implementation of the Jim Crow system. Black people continued to vote in many parts of the South. There was still violence against them, but there were still some Black people holding office in many parts of the South. Civil rights laws remained on the books.
One of the cruel ironies of Reconstruction is that Black people could claim certain rights in the 1870s that they would have to fight to reclaim in the 1960s. Thanks to the Civil Rights Act of 1875, African Americans were guaranteed equal access to hotels, restaurants, theaters, and public transportation. Those who were denied service could expect their rights to be upheld in a court of law. But all that was about to change. Ida B. Wells, a child of slavery and Reconstruction, taught in a segregated school outside Memphis, Tennessee. Being denied access to the all-white first-class car on a railroad trip would propel her to the front lines of civil rights activism.
One day, while riding back to my school, I took a seat in the ladies' coach of the train, as usual. The conductor came along to collect tickets. He told me I would have to go in the other car. I refused. He tried to drag me out of the seat. I fastened my teeth in the back of his hand. He got the baggage man to help him, and they succeeded in dragging me out. White ladies and gentlemen stood on the seats applauding the conductor for his brave stand.
She challenges segregation on public transportation decades before we would ever hear the name Rosa Parks.
She sued, she won in the lower courts, but the railroad appealed the decision. And when the court case went to the Tennessee State Supreme Court, Ida B. Wells lost.
W.E.B. Du Bois summarized Reconstruction in one sentence. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again toward slavery. Yet African Americans had tasted freedom. They had begun to acquire land, build schools, and create social institutions of their own. And though the tide was turning, they refused to give up on the promise of Reconstruction.
Starting in 1890, every Southern state writes a new constitution or passes new laws that deprive Black men of the vote without actually saying the phrase race or Negro or colored. The South goes from a time in which Black and white men are voting in very large numbers to in a very short period of time where they are not. We call that disfranchisement.
Other Southern states took their cue from Mississippi. Voter suppression tactics included literacy tests, poll taxes, and the requirement that potential voters demonstrate that they understood the state constitution. Their combined effect was so successful that they depressed not just the black vote, but the poor white vote as well.
When we're looking at this in the current context, things like voter IDs, the diminishing number of polling places that strategically coincide with communities where African Americans are located, it's not hard to see a connection between these things.
The disenfranchisement of African Americans in the decades after Reconstruction didn't exist in a vacuum. The propaganda campaign to rehabilitate the reputation of the South commenced almost as soon as the Civil War was over, with the publication of a book called The Lost Cause. The Lost Cause argued that the intentions of the Confederacy had been righteous and admirable, in spite of its military defeat. 30 years after the war, this idea took on a new life. The Lost Cause became the ideological justification for white supremacy.
Get to the 1890s. The Lost Cause became not about loss at all. It became a new kind of narrative about the victory over Reconstruction.
There's a kind of entire mythology associated with what Reconstruction was attempting to do, that it involved the subordination of the white population by the black population, that the Reconstruction legislators were ignorant, venal, or worse, predatory.
The Dunning School, for example, named for a Columbia University professor who was hell-bent on proving the point that Black people were incapable of self-governance and that Reconstruction had been a big failure and a big fiasco.
It was all wrong. So it becomes this way of justifying and making a case for why you need Jim Crow.
The Jim Crow system isn't just a series of laws. It's a set of beliefs, philosophies, attitudes, and even stone monuments.
Mitch Landrieu was the mayor of New Orleans between 2010 and 2018. He made a bold, quite controversial decision to remove the Confederate monuments from the city.
There were 4 of these Confederate monuments, 3 in New Orleans, and then there was 1 to the Klan.
Who brought the existence of these statues first to your attention and the fact that they were problematic?
Well, it was my really dear friend who I grew up with, Wynton Marsalis. He said, "Do you know that Louis Armstrong left this city because of that statue?" Or he said, because of the attitude that allowed that statue to stand up. I started to do research, like who owns the monuments, who put them up. I learned that they were put up as a political message by the Daughters of the Confederacy. They wanted to tell the story that the Lost Cause was a noble cause to preserve the South as it was, which at that time, as you know, had people of color enslaved. So that's when I went back and I said, we need to do this.
How difficult was it?
It was painful. It was awful. They firebombed the car of the first contractor. We're in the second decade of the 21st century now. Wow. They firebombed his car. And the people that were taking it out, they would put masks on because they would get death threats.
Mitch, did the vitriol that you encountered, the depth of the vitriol, surprise you?
Yeah, shocked me, actually. It saddened me. And I was sad for our country.
Well, how do you reconcile your own Southern identity with history?
I mean, slavery is the worst thing that's happened in this country. As a Southerner, I kind of get tired of the rest of the country looking down on us, saying everybody down there is backward and racist and can't read and write. That's not who we are. But we have to confront the truth, which is what the Civil War was designed to destroy the country over the cause of slavery. It is not a condemnation. It is a reckoning of how we can get better over time. And we can't do it if we don't recognize that what we did in the past was wrong.
Confederate monuments were only one form of lost cause propaganda that spread across the South in the 1890s. Even more important was retelling and revising the story of slavery itself.
You get a proliferation now of images of slavery, which are more nostalgic. The lithograph printmakers publishing images of the old plantation with happy children, black children playing and an older guy playing a banjo.
There's an incredible romantic idea that during the Grand Old South, when African Americans were slaves, they were prosperous, they were happy, they were joyful, they had everything provided for them. In reality, it's a story that's very much grounded in rape and torture and exploitation, but became a story of familial love.
The happy slave, the bumbling simpleton, the dangerous predator. Racist stereotypes of African Americans came in all shapes and sizes and in vivid color. Newly developed mass printing techniques meant that an unprecedented number of demeaning images of Black people could saturate American popular culture.
The architects of Jim Crow used popular culture and in cartoons all over magazines. You had large-lipped, blackface, near human beings portrayed in every kind. Sometimes they were portrayed as animals.
Advertising images were circulated in popular media outside of the Black community that showed demeaning images of the Black body as undesirable.
So if you want to sell soap, you want to be a clean white person. You don't want to be like these dim-witted Africans as they're arguing in these stereotypes. Then you want to buy these specific brands.
It was a popular cultural use of and denigration in 1,000 ways of the humanity of Black people.
By 1915, with propaganda like the birth of a nation now accepted as historical fact, Black people had little hope for equal rights. Their moment in the sun had long passed, and the shadows were growing longer. But they never abandoned the hope that burned brightly in the earliest years of their emancipation.
If you say Reconstruction was an attempt to remake American society on the basis of equality, well, it didn't succeed in the long term. But it's very important to look at the agency of slaves, men, women, who seized the opportunity presented by the Civil War to push forward their own aspirations.
It's African Americans and radical whites who imagine a different sort of world, who make the high-minded arguments for citizenship, for civil rights, for democracy.
People like Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass knew that they were talented and fully the equal of whites. And they just could not accept this sort of second-class citizenship. And each generation would kind of come to this conclusion again and again, and they would keep on fighting.
I think once we've tasted freedom, once we've experienced freedom, once we've been able to see our agency actually create schools and laws, it drives a constant willingness to continue to sacrifice, to continue to agitate, to continue to demand that which you have experienced. When we look around the world today, we see dynamics and elements of inequality, and we need to have an explanation for it. If you don't know the history of Reconstruction, if you don't know what was tried and then dismantled, then your inference about why we still have these problems is it's a problem with the people. It's a problem with their work ethic, their family structure, their values, rather than it's a problem of an unfinished revolution, which Reconstruction was.
If we define Reconstruction as the process by which our country tried to come to terms with the abolition of slavery, you might say it never ended, because we Americans are still grappling with what it means to be a truly multiracial society with genuine equality for all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Peniel, thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. But you left out the most important thing, brother, which is that I am your daughter's godfather. How about that, huh? That's, for as much as I admire Barbara Jordan, that's more important than the Barbara Jordan chair, the founding director, blah, 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 blah. Iolette, that's my girl. Hi, how are you? And I particularly want to thank Jeannie and Mickey Klein, my new friends, fellow lovers of art. I had never even heard of you before, this invitation. All I knew, I was having dinner at your house. But we're fellow collectors of art, and we have a lot of friends in common, including Peniel. And it's particularly, I know that you all know that lots of people are canceling because of Corona. But I wasn't going to cancel. I'm canceling all kinds of things over the next 2 months. But I wasn't going to cancel this. One, because of my friendship with Peniel. But two, you know, there's a thing called overnights. Let me get my water. And, you know, I have a weekly TV show called Finding Your Roots. And I love doing that TV show. And as Peniel said, the implicit message each week is that the implicit two messages each week. One is that we're all from elsewhere. We're all immigrants. Of course, African Americans are not willing immigrants. Our ancestors were unwilling immigrants, but they were immigrants nonetheless. Even the Native Americans came here 16,000 years ago from across the Bering Strait. So we're all immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants. And at the level of the genome, we are 99.9% the same, regardless of our phenotypical differences. And I think that's why the series is so popular. So the series, the #1 show on PBS, we finally beat Antique Roadshow. I used to love antiques. Not anymore. So Tuesday nights on from 8 to 9. And then on Wednesday, it used to come at 10 o'clock in the morning. Now it's more complicated. So we get it about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. You get overnights. And it tells you exactly how many people watched your program. And then now, because so many people watch on devices and watch in their own time, a week later you get the DVRs that used to be called the +7s. And your audience can go up 20, 25%. So we get a lot of people who watch us on their mobile devices on their own time. And we get a list of, I don't know, I only look at the top 10 list. And every week, the top 3 cities are Seattle, Portland, and Austin, Texas. Now, I figured it's because Peniel left all 10 of those TVs he's got on all the time. So I've never had a chance. I've spoken in South by Southwest a couple times, but I never had a chance to come to UT and thank you, because I know that a lot of the people who watch our TV programs are at this university and are in this room. And I just want to say thank you. And it makes me feel so good. You know, Portland, Seattle, Sacramento, San Francisco, Boston, New York. You figure that, right? But I love that the South is represented by Austin, Texas. So give it up for yourself. So why did we want to do a series about Reconstruction? Well, what's Reconstruction? 12 years of Black freedom, followed by an alt-right rollback. Let's see, what does that remind you of? You know, when I went to PBS, I go, I want to do Reconstruction. They go, nobody cares about that. I go, 12 years of Black freedom, followed by alt-right. They go, how much money do you need? Reconstruction. How many of you studied Reconstruction in high school? Wow, that's a fair number. I didn't study Reconstruction at all. You know, Black History was like Negro Day. That was it. We went all the way from Africa to Martin Luther King in 1 hour. And essentially, it was, you know, I started first grade in 1956 in eastern West Virginia. My family's lived in this county for 200 years. 3 sets of my 4th grade grandparents, who were free Negroes, we would have said, free people of color, lived 30 miles from where I was born. And one of them fought in the American Revolution. My brother and I were sons of the American Revolution, if you could believe that. So my family never moved in the slave experience, and then when they were freed. 2 sets were freed by the American Revolution. The other set, my 4th grade grandparents who lived there, were freed in 1823. So I was born in 1950. I started school in 1956, Brown v. Boards in 1954, schools integrated in my county in 1955. So I always went to the white school, as we called it. So I don't have a story like Richard Wright when somebody told me I couldn't be a doctor. You know, I was treated like a little prince. But, and it was overwhelming, it's an Irish-Italian paper mill town, just a handful of Black people relatively, and most of them my cousins. But I didn't study anything about Black history. And essentially, it was the best thing ever happened to Black people, was that they were brought here from the savagery of Africa and educated at the University of Slavery. I mean, that was it. And at the worst moment in the history of American democracy was the 12 years following the Civil War, when Black men were given powers that they were not entitled to have in the period of Reconstruction. So it was very much the birth of a nation depiction of Reconstruction that I was raised on. But Reconstruction was the period when Black people experienced more freedom and more rights than at any other time in American history. It was the embodiment of Abraham Lincoln's new birth of freedom from the second inaugural. And many historians call it America's second founding. Most schools still don't teach about Reconstruction, skipping from Lee's surrender at Appomattox to Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and the Civil Rights Movement, leaving lots of students wondering why, if Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, why do we need a civil rights movement? So after celebrating the triumphs Black people made under Reconstruction, we ask, how could Black men be given the vote in the year 1867 in the South and in 1870 nationally through the 15th Amendment? And that's very important, that Black men, former slaves, could vote 3 years before free Black men in the North, because it's one of the ironies of Reconstruction. But then be systematically deprived of the vote 20 years later by state constitutional conventions in the South, including one here at Texas. How could America fight our costliest war of all wars to end slavery and save the Union at the cost, latest count, latest estimate, 750,000 lives were lost during the Civil War. Yet see, Jim Crow established as the law of the land by the Supreme Court of the United States, as well as other forms of economic neo-slavery, effectively creating a de facto apartheid state just 31 years after the end of the Civil War. How could this happen? The great Du Bois, first black man to get a PhD at Harvard in 1895, put it this way, as I quoted in the film. He said that under Reconstruction, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. Even many scholars don't know that just about a month before he died, Martin Luther King made a speech pedal on the anniversary of Du Bois's, the 100th anniversary of Du Bois's birth, February 23rd, 1968. And you know, Dr. King would be killed on April 4th of that year. And this is what he said. And he was talking about the significance of Du Bois's book on Reconstruction, which was published in 1935. It's called Black Reconstruction. And Dr. King said, to understand why Du Bois's study of the Reconstruction was a monumental achievement, it's necessary to see it in context. White historians had for a century crudely distorted the Negro's role in the Reconstruction years. It was a conscious and deliberate manipulation of history, and the stakes were high. The Reconstruction was a period in which black men had a small measure of freedom of action. If, as white historians tell it, Negroes wallowed in corruption, opportunism, displayed spectacular stupidity, were wanton, evil, and ignorant, then their case was made. They would have proven that freedom was dangerous in the hands of inferior beings. One generation after another of Americans were assiduously taught these falsehoods, and the collective mind of America became poisoned with racism and stunted with myths, unquote. So understanding Reconstruction and its rollback is pivotal to understanding the history of race relations in this country today, particularly since the end of the Obama administration. Even black people don't know that much about Reconstruction. I did Chris Rock's family tree, and I did Congressman John Lewis's family tree. John Lewis is the closest thing to a saint walking around on the face of the earth. He is. We should all send our prayers to John that he. I love him. I showed Chris Rock the fact that his great-great-grandfather, Julius Caesar Tingman, was elected to the state legislature of South Carolina in 1872 during Reconstruction. He had no idea, and Chris Rock broke down and cried. And he said, if he had known this, it could have changed his life, because when he was 12 or so, he went to his mother and said that he wanted to grow up to be a politician. And you know what his mother said? Little black boys can't grow up to be politicians. And it broke his heart, he said. And in his own family, on his family tree, one of his direct blood ancestors had been a politician. It's amazing, just amazing. And with John, oh my God, we all know that John, I keep reaching for this magical shelf here. We know John was beaten at on Pettus Bridge in 1965 over what? Voting rights. So I showed him, remember I said black men in the South got the right to vote because of the first Reconstruction Act. I showed him his great-great-grandfather's voter registration certificate from 1867. And then we figured out that no one in his family tree had been able to vote because of the rollback of Reconstruction between that ancestor and John Lewis after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And ladies and gentlemen, he looked at me and his head just wham, hit the table, and he wept like a baby. And he had no idea either. He had no idea. So Reconstruction is a pivotal moment in American history. The Constitution was rewritten to establish birthright citizenship. Do you ever wonder where birthright citizenship came from? It's the only way they could figure out how to give the former slaves citizenship. There are only 33 nations in the world today that have birthright citizenship, and that's how birthright citizenship was established, of course, with the 14th Amendment. Equality before the law, regardless of race, and the right to vote for black men. The 13th Amendment, ratified December 6, 1865, abolished slavery. It wasn't an Emancipation Proclamation, it was the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, equal protection and birthright citizenship, that's 1868. And the 15th was the right to vote. Yet the period is a little known and for many decades was widely misunderstood. The issues central to Reconstruction: who has the right to be a citizen in the United States? Who has the right to vote? What should we do when we confront voter suppression? Terrorist violence. Why should we tolerate terrorist violence in a democracy? The relationship between economic and political democracy. All these issues, if you think about it, continue to roil our society and politics today, making an understanding of Reconstruction even more vital. Reconstruction inspired a violent racist reaction, which led, with the approval of the Supreme Court of the United States, to the imposition of the Jim Crow system in the 1890s, only overturned in the Civil Rights era by the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And that period sometimes called the Second Reconstruction. One lesson evident today is that achievements and rights, such as a woman's right to control her own body, achievements thought permanent can be overturned just like that. And our rights can never be taken for granted. The brilliant, remarkable highlights of Reconstruction include the redefinition of citizenship and rights for Black people and all Americans through the civil rights laws and constitutional amendments. And even before the 14th and 15th Amendments were ratified, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is still on the books, passed over Andrew Johnson's veto, established birthright citizenship, and stated that Black people must enjoy the same rights as white people. It also granted federal officials the authority to prosecute anyone who violated that new law. And the law remains on the books today. Congress then passed 4 Reconstruction Acts in 1867 and 1868, also over President Johnson's veto. And these Reconstruction Acts carved the defeated Confederate states, 10 of the 11 states, all but Tennessee, into 5 military districts, and required each of them to hold elections for new constitutional conventions, which wouldn't be legitimate unless Black men were given the right to vote. That's why Black men got the right to vote in 1867. They also had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Now, keep in mind, we all think that in the North, Black men had all these rights. Black men could only vote in 5 of the 6 New England states, in all the North, and in the state of New York, if they satisfied a $250 property requirement. They couldn't vote in Pennsylvania, in any of the other northern states until the ratification of the 15th Amendment. The granting of the right to vote to former slaves throughout the South was greeted with tremendous grassroots ferment among both Black women and Black men. Black women couldn't vote, but they went to the political organizations, they made their husbands register to vote. 80% of all eligible Black men in the South in the summer of 1867 registered to vote. 80%. Think about that. That's incredible. And guess what? In 1868, they voted. Ulysses S. Grant won the presidency in 1868. He won the Electoral College overwhelmingly, but he won the popular vote by just over 300,000 votes. 500,000 Black men cast their votes for Ulysses S. Grant. Black men had elected a president of the United States. Black men who had been slaves just 3 years before. South Carolina, as you heard Jim Clyburn, who made Joe Biden maybe the next Democratic nominee of the for president, will know by the time we eat that brisket at your house. We will know, but that was Jim Clyburn. And I was sitting in his office, and that's the most powerful black man in Congress. As Jim said, South Carolina elected a black majority to its lower house, a black Secretary of State, a black treasurer. So I wasn't the first black treasurer in the United States. South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority black states. And Florida, Alabama, and Georgia were almost majority black states. Think about that. There was a mini black republic in the South. No one, you see, expected these former slaves who were illiterate by law, by and large, right? It was illiterate to teach a slave to read, right? No one expected them to seize the right to vote as dramatically as black men did. And this scared the bejesus out of not only the former Confederates in the South, but I think even many liberal white people in the North. It was too much power too quickly. And if their power had remained unfettered, they really, in those 6 states, would have had a tremendous amount of authority. And I'm going to repeat that. South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana had majority black populations. Florida, Alabama, and Georgia close by. So the potential for black political domination was seen as a very real threat to white power. Between 1870 and 1877, 16 congressmen were elected, including 2 United States senators. And by 1901, there had been a total of 20 black men elected to the House and 2 elected to the Senate. But overall, at every level of government, local government and state government in the former Confederacy, 2,000 black men were elected to office during Reconstruction. And meanwhile, the black community was busy building itself in freedom, reuniting families. One of the most moving things that we discussed was advertisements in newspapers. Have you seen my mother, who was sold away from a plantation down the river from Virginia? I mean, it just tears your heart up. And a lot of those ads were effective, and of course, a lot more weren't. But many families were reunited. Churches were built. Mother Emanuel, where we start the film, where Dylann Roof killed those 9 innocent people, was regenerated in 1865 under the Reverend Richard Kane. The South's first, this is so shocking. I didn't even know this till I did the film. The South's first state-funded public school systems were authorized by integrated Reconstruction governments throughout the South. There wasn't state-funded public schools. And then, of course, the founding of the HBCUs, the historically black colleges and universities. But these gains did not come without a great cost. Lynchings, violence, rape, intimidation, fraud. I said that the 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865. Guess what else was born in December 1865? The Ku Klux Klan. So simultaneously, with this unprecedented amount of freedom, was an alt-right rollback. There were 8 major massacres between 1865 and 1876. Memphis, New Orleans, Camilla, Meridian, Colfax, Coushatta, Vicksburg, and Hamburg. 3,724 lynchings occurred between 1889 and 1930, 80% of them black, and some of them Jewish people. The history of anti-Semitism and the history of anti-black racism go hand in hand in this country, and it's something that it's often not commented upon. Slavery had ended, but what remained the leading cash crop, the leading export in the United States through the 1930s? Cotton. And somebody had to pick that cotton. The need for cheap labor for the cotton industry led to sharecropping, which is a form of neo-slavery, peonage, and then vagrancy acts that allowed idle, quote unquote, idle black men to be arrested, imprisoned, and then sentenced to work on a chain gang, doing, among other things, picking cotton. Then came the first Great Depression. It used to be called the Great Depression until the Great Depression, and they had to give it another name. But it was the panic, now called the Panic of 1873. And it made even good-hearted people question, can we still afford Reconstruction? And then a conservative Supreme Court, as many scholars in this room know, that court was made up of several justices who had been appointed by Abraham Lincoln, ironically. And they did their best to eviscerate the Reconstruction constitutional amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. Notably, U.S. v. Cruikshank in 1876, saying that the 14th Amendment is only about state action and not private behavior. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which gave Ida B. Wells the right, she thought, to sit in the first-class car on that train, was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883. And then starting in 1890, the Mississippi Plan. Each Southern state held a constitutional convention, rewrote their constitution in ways that allowed them to, well, explicitly replace Reconstruction era constitutions, and then introduce things like poll taxes, literacy tests, and so that voter participation eroded. You want to know how dramatic it eroded? In Louisiana, in 1898, before their state constitutional convention, there were 130,000 black men registered to vote. By 1904, Jeannie, that number had been reduced precisely to 1,324. That's amazing, but that's how effective this rollback was. And then came the revision of the memory of the war and racist interpretations of Reconstruction, the Lost Cause campaign. I made my graduate students at Harvard read. I made them watch Birth of a Nation. Many of us think of the Birth of a Nation being about slavery. It's about Reconstruction and about how black men were not competent to run state legislatures. But I made them read a little book called The Measuring Rod. And it's written by Mildred Lewis Rutherford, the Historian General of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And it's a slim little book, and it was sent to every library in America and to many teachers. And it says, and I'm quoting, reject a book that says the South fought the Civil War to hold her slaves. Reject a book that speaks of the slaveholder of the South as cruel and unjust. Reject a book that glorifies Abraham Lincoln. Her common core, in other words, was the lost cause. She was a genius. They were geniuses. They knew it was all about the narrative. It was all about memory. And this effort led to the construction of so many of the Confederate monuments that we see today. The rollback of Reconstruction lasted far longer than Reconstruction itself, and it continues to this day. Today's rollback is part of the reaction, let's be honest, to the election of the first black president. His 8 years in the White House stirred up massive racial resentment, as we saw with Donald Trump's campaign and presidency, which manipulated the tropes of white supremacy and white racial fear. People ask me, is Donald Trump a racist? I don't know Donald Trump. I've never met him. And I don't believe in just calling people racist. So I always say, no, Whoopi asked me on The View. And I go, no, I don't think he's a racist like the head of the Ku Klux Klan, who studied the history, so-called black people and how he related to monkeys and apes. And these guys have theories that are deeply racist. But Donald Trump is a genius at manipulating the tropes of white supremacy. And I don't think anybody can deny that. This is why the history of Reconstruction matters, because the problems that emerged during Reconstruction, ladies and gentlemen, have never been resolved in our country. Brian Stevenson, who created what I call the Lynching Museum, but it's not really that, in Montgomery, a good friend of mine, gave an interview to Vox magazine that was published in 2017. And he said, I actually think the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude and forced labor. The true evil of American slavery, he continues, was a narrative we created to justify it. They made up this ideology of white supremacy that cannot be reconciled with our Constitution, that cannot be reconciled with the commitment to fair and just treatment of all people. They made it up so they could feel comfortable while enslaving other people. Slavery, he concludes, didn't end in 1865. It just evolved. The North won the Civil War, but the South, he concludes, won the narrative war. So now, ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues and I believe it's time to change the narrative. We made this series to show that if we could get through the nightmare of the rollback of Reconstruction through the imposition of Jim Crow, the low point, the nadir, as historians call it, after Rayford Logan, the nadir in American race relations, then we can get through the new surge of white supremacist rhetoric, birtherism, the attack on affirmative action in the courts, gerrymandering and voter suppression, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and anti-immigrant feelings, the new nadir in American race relations that we are experiencing in our society, sadly, today. It's a truism. It's often said that history repeats itself, but that's true only if we let it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you so much. Let's give it up for Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr.
Thank you.
Harvard University. Well, I want to.
Could I get my little cup of water that I kept trying not to spill? You know, I have to tell you a funny story. One time I was giving a lecture, and water is slightly risque, but not really. It's a trigger one. I had the water on. The reason I had to put it on that shelf is that the lectern is slanted. So I put my water on the slanted thing, and I kept punching points, you know, with my hand. I'm, you know, like that. And about a half hour later, I moved my leg, and my leg was wet. And I thought, oh my God, I've become incontinent. And I go, oh Jesus, you know, and all people are going to remember is that I peed my pants, you know.
Well, one, I want to thank you for that.
It's a true story.
I'm going to have a transition here. Thank you for the wonderful anecdote as well. But really the lecture. I mean, I think I want to talk to you about Reconstruction, but also just race and democracy, the 1619 Project, the 2020 election. Sure. What can we? Because right now you're not, like I said in the introduction. I think what's extraordinary about you is really your intellectual curiosity, and that and not just about things, but also about people, about ideas. Whoever you meet, you make them feel like they're the only person in the room, that they really matter, which I really appreciate. When you think about Reconstruction, and I think you're right, that it's a narrative that most people don't know, and I love the fact that your films reach millions of people, and so we're really you're sort of a general in that narrative war. Brian Stevenson as well, yes. Right? And we had Sherilyn Ifill, and she's part of that narrative war too. Yeah, brilliant.
I'm on her board.
You're on our board, absolutely. When we think about Reconstruction and racial slavery, the New York Times had the 1619 Project. Khalil Muhammad was part of it, Nicole Hannah-Jones, all these great people. In a lot of ways, I always thought about your work vis-a-vis that, because I think your work has been trailblazing in terms of making us look at not just racial slavery, but even ancient African history all the way to the present. Right. Both in art and culture and politics. This narrative war that you're talking about, what can we do now, all of us here in this room? People come to hear you speak in the context of 2020 and even beyond, and how can that impact us in terms of trying to transform citizenship and democracy?
A great question. My motivation, thank you very much for the compliments that you gave me. I love people. It's something you can't fake. You know, I love a good story, and I love people, and everybody's got a good story.
Put it up closer.
I'm closer? I'm sorry. You want me to say it again? I love people. I love a good story. My father was a great storyteller. And my mother was the first colored secretary of the PTA in Piedmont, West Virginia, as we would have said back then. And all the black people in my town would go to the monthly meeting to see my mother stand up and read the minutes. And Mama would write the obituary for all the black people in the Potomac Valley, where I grew up. Remember, where I grew up is halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington on the Potomac River, 2,000 people. And she was just the obituary writer for people would call and say, Pauline, you know, my mother died, would you write something? And it would be in the paper. And then she would go to church and stand up and read that obituary. So my first image of a writer was my own beautiful mother. And my father was just so funny. My father made Red Fox look like an undertaker. You know, like, when we would be coming back from the church, I would go to all these performances, as far as I was concerned, before I started first grade. And my father and mother would be walking, they'd be holding hands, and I'd be holding their hands. And my father would say, my mother's name was Pauline Augusta Coleman. Say, Pauline, you did such a good job today. I started to get up and open the casket to see if that son of a bitch was still buried in there. Now, how could I not love stories? I was just raised with humor. My goal has been to be multilingual. The book I got tenure on was The Signifying Monkey, which is all about post-structuralism and deconstruction. My brother is an oral surgeon. He just retired. And I remember he said to me, when are you going to write a book that mom and daddy could read? And I sat down and wrote Colored People.
Yeah, you remember.
And well, my mom died and my daughters were little kids. And I wanted them to remember the colored world of the 50s and really my mother. And so, and the reaction to that book was really great. I mean, it made a lot of bestseller lists. And then the same year, a woman from England wrote me a letter, and she had seen me on a late night. It's like the Tonight Show in England, but for books. And I was on it talking about the canon wars of the 1990s, trying to get the Norton anthologies, put Zora Neale Hurston and Frederick Douglass and Jean Tuber in them, you know, and I was part of that war, which we won. And she wrote to me and she said, I was in bed, I watched you, and I could put you in front of a camera. You can be a host or a narrator, you know, a presenter, they call it in England. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen, I had never told anybody, never. But when I first saw Kenneth Clark's Civilization, which you too will remember, which is about the history of Western art, and then Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man, 1969, I can't remember The Ascent of Man, early 70s, when there's an academic in front of the camera talking to you and walking you through a thing. I was raised to be a medical doctor. But I was at Yale and I watched these documentaries and I thought, man, that I really would like a chance to do that. But it was so unlikely. You know, I was going to be a medical doctor. I even took a year off at a program, kind of like the Peace Corps, that Yale had, that it was called 5-year BA. It was such a cool program. You took the year off between a gap year in the middle of your education between your sophomore and junior year. And you went to the so-called third world, the developing world. They only picked 12 kids, very competitive. I applied and I always wanted to go to Africa and I went to Tanzania and I worked in a mission hospital.
How were you 19 when you did this?
Yeah, I turned 20 in the village of Kilimatindi. And anyway, this woman wrote me a letter and just named my secret desire. I mean, I can't tell you what a miracle this is. And I was so stunned I threw it in the trash, you know, like I didn't want to get my hopes. And she wrote me again, and she wrote me again. And no internet, man. It was just like the mail.
Yeah.
And finally, she flew all the way over from London. She had her own production company. And to have breakfast with me in Cleveland, where we give the Annis Field Wolf Book Awards, the Multicultural Pulitzer Prize. And I go, what do you want with me? And she goes, I'm going to make you a star. You just don't know it, you know?
Yeah.
And she goes, I'm going to raise the money. And so the first documentary I did was for the BBC series called The Great Rail Journeys. And a well-known person spends 3 weeks riding with a film crew on trains somewhere in the world. And they wanted me to do it in Japan or South America. And I go, no, but I'll do it in Africa. And I would do it only under 2 conditions. If you let me take my daughters, who were mixed race, one was 12 and one was 14. And so the conceit was the professor of African-American studies trying to get his mixed race children to find their roots in Africa, right? And I said, the other condition was that the 3 weeks would end in the village in central Tanzania, where I had lived when I was 19 and had my 20th birthday. So they said, deal on Africa, but taking 2 adolescents to Africa, are you crazy? You know, adolescents are totally out of control. And I said, okay, I'm not going to do it then. And they said, all right, we'll send a producer over to have dinner with your family to see if your kids, you know, could handle this. So I set my daughters down. I said, if you blow this, you're dead. You know, like, call me sir, yes, daddy, you know.
And so it worked out.
And they were perfect. And the reason that the film worked, there were 2 reasons. One, I was so pompous and I was so nervous. I wanted this so bad. I wanted to do such a good job. I had no training. And so I would give them little lectures and they would roll their eyes. So in effect, the conceit, as I said, was that I was trying to get them to find their African roots. And their response was, our African roots are in Lexington, Massachusetts. Thank you very much. Now, when could I get a Big Mac? I just want to get out of here. And then I had a cameraman who taught me those things. When I look at the camera, they're called pieces of the camera or stand-ups. You see them on the evening news. They're very hard to do. And he taught me how to do them. And so that was the beginning of my career.
All right, I want to get a couple of questions in right here. So I'm gonna.
No, what he wants. He wants me to do his podcast if you all leave. So he's trying to get rid of you.
So we're gonna use this, if anything. So Reconstruction, 2020 election. Why is it important? And I'm gonna briefly, and then I'm gonna ask another question about the new documentary too.
Okay,
yes,
that's great. 2020 election. What time is it? You know, it's the polls will be closing, and we'll know tonight.
But voting rights. March 7th is going to be 55 years since Edmund Pettus Bridge. You just talked about John Lewis, who I've met too. I love.
And voter suppression. Is rampant.
And so, how do we connect Reconstruction to that?
We just did.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to fight against voter suppression. We have to fight against the rollback of women's rights to have an abortion. You know, that we have to be vigilant. We have a conservative Supreme Court that's hell-bent on rolling back affirmative action. I don't know about your generation, but I went to Yale, as you know, in September '69. I was one of 96 black kids who hit Yale in September '69. You know who was in my class? Sheila Jackson Lee over in Houston.
Yes.
I met Sheila at a party on the Saturday night.
Yeah.
Kurt Schmoke, the first black mayor of Baltimore.
Yes.
Let's see, there was a little nerdy guy who was pre-med. I always forget his
Ben
name.
Carson.
Oh man, that was my joke. You know?
Oh, I thought you were giving that to me. Okay, sorry about that.
No, and Candy Carson, his wife, who was in the class behind me. We were the children of affirmative action. Why do I say that? Because the class of '66 at Yale had 6 black guys to graduate. what was there, genetic blip in the race, and all of a sudden there were 90 more smart black people in 69 they were? Of course not. There was a racist quota on the number of black people who could go to Yale. There was a quota on the number of Jews who could get in, a quota even till 63 on the number of Irish people who could get in. So we have to fight against the rollback of affirmative action, women's rights, the right to vote. It's the future of our democracy is at stake. And it affects all of us, black, white, male, female, gay, straight. It is the most urgent problem confronting our democracy today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to ask you about the new film that you're currently in the process of making.
The one you asked me if you could star in back there in the green.
I don't know if I really did, but yeah, I'd like to, even if I didn't say that. Yeah, thank you.
Well, you know, most of us think that during the Great Migration, all the black people in the South left and went north. But everybody in the South knows that's not true. The black middle class didn't move. Martin Luther King, whose grandfather, was third generation minister at Ebenezer. Martin Luther King only left the South. He went to Morehouse. He only left the South to go to BU to get a PhD and then went back to the South. Andy Young's father was a dentist in New Orleans. I want to do what Dr. Du Bois called lifting the veil. Said the Negro world was a world behind the veil. I want to lift that world and see what black people did once Jim Crow was imposed in the segregated, but it's going to be called Making Black America, the segregated North and the segregated South.
Yeah, and I like that you're saying segregated North, because the narrative, and you've been talking about narratives this evening, says that somehow black people had it easier, in quotes, in the North.
Right.
That it wasn't as segregated, it wasn't as bad. And what's the reality?
Well, the reality is black people could vote in the North, as you well know, and many, not all schools were integrated. As you know better than anybody in this room, Malcolm X went to a white school.
Yes.
Right, in Michigan.
In Michigan, yeah.
And if you haven't read Peniel's book on Malcolm and Martin, you should. Peniel's a great scholar. And he is. He's brilliant and a great communicator. Don't step on your applause line. So no one has told that story. And I want to show how healthy black culture was. How black people, when they were denied access to white institutions, formed their own institutions. So on the one hand, Malcolm X went to a white school in the 8th grade or whatever it was, but Yale had a quota on black kids till 1969. You know, so that's why Thurgood Marshall met Charles Hamilton Houston, who had graduated from Harvard Law School, at Howard. I would, without affirmative action, I would have gone to college. 3 generations of my family. The first member of my family graduated from a woman, my great aunt, from Howard Nursing School, what became the nursing school, in 1909. And then 3 generations of dentists and doctors have graduated from Howard. So I would have gone to Howard or Morehouse, but I wouldn't have gone to Yale. And that's what affirmative action did. And because of affirmative action, the black middle class doubled and the black upper middle class quadrupled since the day Martin Luther King was killed. But the percentage of black children added to the poverty line is still remarkably close to what it was when Martin Luther King was alive. So that affirmative action created a class divide within the black community.
And you talk about the segregated South as well. What are some interesting complexities that you're uncovering?
Well, there was a huge black middle class in the South that continued to thrive. Look at Vernon Jordan. Yes. You know, his mother was in the black middle class. She was a caterer. And all these people it started with the free Negro community. If you look at the 1860 federal census, I know you all are going to do this when you go home, you know, look it up. There were 488,000 free black people in 1860. And there were 3.9 million enslaved black people. Of that 488,000 black people, 262,000 lived in the South. It's counterintuitive. 222,000 lived in the North.
It is counterintuitive. You would think that they lived outside the South.
We were taught that you were like Frederick Douglass. As soon as you could, you ran away.
Yes.
Right? But once, in my case, when one set of my fourth great grandparents were freed, we have Abraham Van Meter's will in Hardy County, Virginia, now West Virginia, again, 30 miles from where I was born. And he gave them 1,000 acres of land. So if you're free, what are you gonna do? Leave 1,000 acres of land and do what? Go to New York, be homeless? Live where you don't know anybody? Of course not. So people were freed. Freeing a slave was punitive. You had to give them something to survive. And people stayed in the South, and they built churches and schools, which were excellent. And if you were college educated, you couldn't get a job at a white institution. So you went back and you taught at a black high school, like Dunbar High School in Washington or M Street High School, which was as good as Exeter or Andover, So, and the Elks and the Odd Fellows and all those fraternal organizations wouldn't integrate. So like the Prince Hall Masons, the Masons weren't integrated, so you started your own Masons. They created a world within a world. And I want to tell that story. It's a marvelous story. And in some ways, some things were lost when under desegregation, and other things weren't.
What are some of the things that were lost under desegregation, you think?
Well, that sense of community. I don't want to over romanticize it, but because of residential segregation, you had a multi-class neighborhood. The doctor, the dentist, the undertaker, the lawyer lived not too far away from a janitor or a maid or a factory worker. So there was more of a sense of community. And of course, as soon as residential segregation ended, you wanted to live where people in your economic class lived. So when William Julius Wilson, as you know, is an expert on this, when work disappears. So people moved to the suburbs. And then that left a black, disenfranchised economic class on its own with no role models in the inner city.
Okay, final question. I want to, thank you for what you've done here tonight and really for all the work you do. But I want you to leave us with a charge, really, in the sense of, you talked about this narrative war, right? And this idea, you're doing the work. How can all of us, one, support the work you're doing, but really right here in Austin, Texas, beside absolutely watching Finding Your Roots, on the weekly.
Oh, I would never do that.
And all your films, what can we do to participate and contribute to this narrative war?
That's a great question. You know what? I think the most powerful two things you could do: register and vote. And finally, whenever white supremacy rears its ugly head in any of its pernicious manifestations, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, anti-immigrant feeling, xenophobia, homophobia, whenever white supremacy rears its ugly head, we have to join together in interracial coalitions and crush it till it's dead.
All right, that's the mic drop. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. Thank you for all of you for coming out tonight. This is an extraordinary evening. Thank you so much.